Hey folks, in this video we're going to look at the CSS display property. Now the display property helps determine how an element looks on the web page. Most HTML elements will have their display property set to either block or inline by default. So this means that even if you don't write any CSS, the browser still has some built-in styles that will automatically get applied to all elements. Now, some examples of block elements are headline tags like H1, H2, and so on, as well as paragraph tags and div tags. Now, block elements will take up all available horizontal space. And if you have multiple block elements one after the other, they're going to stack vertically from top to bottom, kind of like a stack of blocks. So let's take a look at how block elements behave on a website. Now, in our demo website here, I'm going to create an H1 tag with some text. And I'm going to create a paragraph tag and have some lorem ipsum text, maybe 50 words. So there we go. And then in our styles, I'm going to add a background color to both the H1 and paragraph tags. So now you can see that their boxes extend all the way out to the full width available, even if the text doesn't go all the way across like in the headline tag. You can also set width and height on block elements. So I'm going to set them to have a width of, let's say, 200 pixels. So now you can see that they are both 200 pixels wide. However, they are not going to be displayed side by side, even if there is enough room, because by default, block elements are going to always be on their own line. Now let's talk about inline elements. Some examples of inline elements are anchor tags, strong tags, EM or emphasis tags, image tags, and span tags. Now, in contrast to block elements, inline elements are only going to take up as much space as their content needs. And if you have multiple inline elements one after the other, they're going to be displayed horizontally in a line. Then if they run out of room, they will wrap to a new line and then continue on. You can think about this like words in a paragraph. So let's take a look at how inline elements are going to behave on the web page. So I'm going to add a strong tag. And let's wrap it around some of the text here and save. So now we can see the strong tag, and let's inspect it as well. So you can see that the strong tag starts kind of in the middle of one of the lines of text. So again, unlike block elements, the inline elements are not going to, start on a new line. Instead, the strong tag, as you can see here, sort of continues the flow of words in the paragraph tag from left to right, and then it's going to wrap to a new line when necessary. So let's add some styles to our strong tag here. So I'm going to set it to have a background color here. And you can see a little bit better now how the box of the strong tag is going to wrap. And there's a tiny little bit of white space between the lines. So you can think of inline elements as one really long rectangle, as you can see here, and they're going to chop up into multiple lines in order to fit on the page. Now, one thing that you can't do with inline elements is set width and height, and we can try here and I'll show you what happens. So I'm going to set a width of 400 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. If I save, you might have noticed nothing changed on the website. So let's inspect this again and see what's going on. So down here in our rules, we have our styles for width and height, but they are grayed out, indicating that they're not taking any effect. And if I hover over this tooltip here, it says width has no effect because it has a display of inline. You can try adding display inline block or block to the element to change the display property value. So let's try that here. So we are going to talk about inline block a little bit later in this video, but for now, let's just set display to block. So this is going to turn the strong tag to be a block element instead of an inline element. So when we save, you can see now that it is a block. It's no longer continuing the flow of words in the paragraph, but it's on its own line, and the width and height properties are now taking effect. Now, some other differences between block and inline elements is that with block elements, you can add padding, border, and margin on all four sides, and they will always take effect and push away neighboring elements. So for the H1 tag, if I add padding of 40 pixels, you can see that this adds space around the H1 tag, and it's pushing the paragraph below it further down. However, adding padding, border, and margin works differently with inline elements. So instead of the H1 tag, let's add that 40 pixels of padding to the strong tag. And you can see that things are a little bit different. So if I inspect this and I force highlighting, you can see that the space is added at the beginning before the first word in the strong tag, and then at the end after the last word in the strong tag. However, it's not adding space in the vertical directions top or bottom. Even though the padding does technically exist, we can see it on the website, it's just overlapping the surrounding content. It's not actually adding any space. So it's only adding space in the inline direction, meaning to the left and to the right. So you can actually see this a little bit better if I change padding to be just padding inline. So now, if I highlight, you can see that the padding has been added on the left of the strong tag and then on the right at the very end. So again, you can think about the strong tag and any inline tag as just one really long rectangle that gets chopped up into multiple lines to fit. So this is why the padding on the left and right only gets added before the first word and then after the last word. So to sum up block and inline elements, block elements take up 100% of the available width and will each be on their own line, with new block elements added in the block direction moving from top to bottom. And inline elements will have their width based on the size of the content inside the element, with new inline elements added in the inline direction moving from left to right in a line, and then they'll wrap to a new line when they run out of space. This default behavior of how elements are laid out on the page is called normal flow or flow layout. Now, having just block and inline elements, it worked fine back when the internet was still relatively new and most websites looked basically like Word documents. However, as people wanted to make designs more complex and cool, we needed new CSS rules in order to make that possible. Now, one feature that we needed was something between inline and block elements. This is where display inline block comes in. So let me show you an example of what you can do with inline block. Now on our demo website, I want to add a button under the paragraph. So I'm going to create an anchor link with a class of button. And I'm going to make the text say click here. So here's our link. And in our styles, let's add a selector for the button class. And in it, I want to get rid of some of the default styles for anchor links, like you can see that underline below it. We can get rid of that with text decoration, none. And we also want it to kind of look like a button, so let's add some colors. So I'll add background color navy, and let's add color white. There we go. And to make it look a little bit more like a button, let's add some padding. So let's add padding, 20 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 40 on the left and the right. And here is our button. However, I'm not sure if you can see this, but it looks like the button's kind of overlapping. It's kind of running into the paragraph. So let's see what's going on there. So if I inspect the paragraph, you can see that it does have a margin on the top and the bottom. This is one of the browser default styles for paragraphs. And the bottom margin, you would think that it would push away the button below it, but it looks like it's just ending right where the text of the button starts. Even though the button itself, has padding. And the top padding of the button itself isn't pushing away the paragraph's margin. It just kind of, keeps going and overlapping into it. So this is happening because by default, the anchor link is an inline element. And as we mentioned earlier, with inline elements, vertical padding, border, and margin, meaning on top and bottom, will not take effect. Only the horizontal ones will. So because the anchor link is an inline element, the vertical padding that we have on the button isn't actually pushing the button away from the paragraph. So to make that vertical padding actually make some space, let's first try setting the display property of the button to block. And this is going to override the default inline value of display. So you can see that things do look different. And now the button is indeed pushing away the paragraph. So now the bottom margin of the paragraph is ending right at the top of the button, which is kind of what you would expect. However, as you can see, the button is now going all the way across because it is a block element, and it's going to take up all available horizontal space. So this is where inline block comes in really handy. If I change the button's display property to be inline block instead of block and save, now you can see that the button is only as wide as the text content inside it, plus the padding. So inline block is like a nice hybrid of both inline and block element behaviors. It's going to be sized according to the content, like inline elements, but then the vertical padding, border, and margin will take effect like in block elements. An inline block is also helpful if you want to have elements side by side. For example, let's duplicate that button that we have. So we have two of them, and they are side by side because they are going to behave like inline elements in terms of sizing, and they'll be displayed next to one another if there is enough available space. And you can also see that there's a little white space between the two buttons. This is because in our markup, there's space between buttons, and it creates space called white space. And you can actually see it if we go to the Firefox developer tools in the source code. Here's the first button, and then there's white space here, and then the second button. Usually it doesn't really matter, like in this case, it doesn't really matter that there's a little space there, but there are some cases where you might not want that little white space. So the only way to get rid of it is to remove any space between those two elements. So we have to remove all the space so that they are literally right next to each other in the markup like that. And now that space is gone. But again, in our case here, we actually kind of like the space. So using inline block to put elements side by side this way was really helpful back in the days before we had Flexbox and Grid. Now that we do have them, it's not as common to use inline block for this purpose, but it is kind of nice to be able to put these two buttons side by side without having to create a parent div to contain these two buttons like we would need to create if we were using Flexbox or Grid to put them side by side. Now, another value of the display property is display none. So let me show you what that does. In our styles, I'm going to set the paragraph to be display none. Then when we save our website, the paragraph disappears and the buttons move up to take up the space where the paragraph used to be in. And if we look in our inspector, you can see the HTML markup for the paragraph does still exist, but it's grayed out, meaning that it doesn't exist in the document anymore, and it's not taking up any space. Now, I mentioned earlier that the way that block and inline elements are displayed is called the normal flow or flow layout. And this is considered the default layout mode in CSS. But there are other layout modes that you can use to display and position elements in different ways from what's considered the normal flow. And you can change the layout mode of an element by changing some of the element's properties to a different value from their default. For example, you can use positioned layout mode by setting the position property to a value like relative, absolute, sticky, or fixed. You can use flexible box or flexbox mode by setting display to flex. And you can use grid mode by setting display to grid. Now, these four layout modes, normal flow, positioned, flexbox, and grid, are by far the most commonly used ways to lay out elements on a web page. And we are going to be covering these other layout modes in the rest of this series. There are a few other modes that exist, but they're not as commonly used, so I'm not going to make a whole video about them. But briefly, they are float layout, which is usually used to wrap text around an image that's aligned to the left or the right. There's also table layout, where you can display data in rows and columns like in a spreadsheet. And there's multi-column layout, where you can arrange content in multiple columns like a newspaper. All right, so that's it for the CSS display property. In the next video, we're going to be looking at the position property.